Well, my experience with education in general was quite bad, which is not to say that there aren't remarkable teachers like struggling across the United States to do a wonderful job. I'm sure there are, and I certainly have spoken to people who talk about this teacher or that teacher. And I had a couple teachers who were quite good, but always those people are like battling against the waves with a sword.
And what are the waves?
Oh, well, the waves are just that generally the more experimentally or the more you want to teach with intuition, the more the administrations are against you. So you're not only, it's hard enough to be adventurous and to teach in a beautiful way. Just that's a large task by itself. And then on top of that, to be using one hand to fend off administrators is pretty, makes it more difficult. So that's kind of what I was referring to. When I did have good teachers, they tended to be teachers who were putting on some kind of a really remarkable performance that emanated from their, I don't know, some kind of genius or like a deep, powerful empathy, really like bravura performances. And I did have teachers like that, a few in like one in college, a couple of different times. And I just think that this is no way for a mechanism to function. Like, if you want to have a spoon and eat soup with a spoon, it doesn't have to be the best spoon that anyone ever made. A regular, simple spoon is fully sufficient to eat soup. And this is the way that education should be. That the system is set up so that you don't need, Socrates to teach you something. It can just be like a regular, thoughtful person.
Welcome to Teaching Art, a 3-part collaged audio essay in which I, as somebody who teaches art, try to find out what that exactly means. What should we teach? Who should we be when we teach it? And what kind of space should the Art Academy be? In the last episode, we focused on that last question. In this one, we'll focus on the second one. What kind of teachers do we need in the Art Academy? I've started this episode with a lengthy quote by author and teacher Jesse Ball on his own experience as a student. I asked him about it because in his book, Notes on My Dunce Cap, he wrote about how uncomfortable he was when he was first asked to teach. And apparently that discomfort comes from mistrusting the system, the mechanisms of teaching, based on his own experience. For me, it was quite different. I was ready to go. I wanted to teach. I didn't even consider the system I would be operating in. To be honest, I had no idea. I just had my plans, my assignments, and my massive PowerPoints. I thought I had it all figured out until I started doing it.
When I started teaching, I started like stepping very strongly at the very beginning. And I remember once I had like 15 students and only 2 remained after the first 3 months. So the director of studies of Escuela de Escritores just basically she called my attention like, hey, you had like 15 students and only 2 are left.
You just heard Lorena Briedis, a fellow creative writing teacher at Escuela de Escritores in Spain. Though I did not lose any students like Lorena did, in my first years of teaching, I was still dissatisfied with what I taught. And maybe more precisely, how I taught it. I felt like a lot of it wasn't connecting. And in hindsight, I can see at least one thing I didn't realize then, and that is I was teaching creative writing the way I was taught philosophy at university. I was used to long lectures, lots of assignments, and having to read a lot. But that wasn't how I learned creative writing. I learned that through messing around, reading, yes, but reading all over the place, following my instincts. And I mostly learned it from talking to fellow writers, to friends. Problem was, I had no idea of how to teach that. And frankly, I was getting frustrated about it.
And I think the thing we need to remember is that, it's okay not to know everything or feel you have to know everything as the instructor. I think it's a lot more liberating to help you meet the students where they're at when you're able to work with decentering your kind of role in the place and not being the kind of so-called sage on the stage, right? Really trying to be open to learning from them, because we have so much to learn from them, whether they're first year students or, high functioning grad students. And I think we get away from what's really true and good about teaching when we stop seeing the process as a two-way exchange. If we just see it as a one-way exchange where we're just disseminating information, that's a zero-sum game in the end. It's not going to make for a sustainable activity. It's not going to feed well into our own kind of writing careers or our own teaching careers. But if we see this constantly as this exciting exchange of ideas and perspectives and things to think about, then I think this is probably one of the most powerful ways to kind of advance and feel fresh toward our teaching perspectives, whether it's in the current environment we're in now or in this future kind of utopian art school that we're sort of musing about.
I guess that was my biggest mistake starting out, being too much of a teacher. I believe that my intentions were in the right place. I really wanted them to succeed, and I thought it was my job to be a knowledge machine, spewing out story structures, literary terminology, and a selection of the best works ever made, according to me. I wanted them to not take the long road I took. Essentially, I was telling them everything I knew in a semester. But by doing so, not only did I take away their chance to discover these things themselves, I also, though inadvertently, reproduced a hierarchy that I was used to from studying philosophy. A hierarchy that was maybe one the students had run into before.
Hierarchy, it doesn't necessarily have to be like determinedly a bad thing, or we could say that it can be quite useful in learning. In a way, one wants for oneself to be at all times ready to take lower status and to subordinate oneself to people who know more than you do about things in order to learn from them. But that has to be a process that emerges from you and that you control, so that when it's time for you to break, like intellectually, from what the speaker is saying, you're prepared and strong enough to, often in hierarchies that are enforced from above, you don't get the opportunity for these kinds of breaks. So I think a hierarchy that is created from below, where you're just as a function of learning, is essentially like a Zen, the beginner mind of Zen mind, where you're looking to others all as teachers. Everyone is your teacher in some way, So I think it can be good in that sense, but there's just too much of it already in society, especially in like invisible and sort of destructive ways. The mass media complex creating a vision of like a life, like of several celebrity life, or the life of the people on television that you can never live, that then makes you feel that your own life is inferior to that life. So already there's this hierarchy of like, here on the bottom is the life that you're living, and then the tendency of human beings is not to attempt to rise up, but to just keep others down below them. So if you want to like keep other people from being, like jumped up, like trying to reach the higher levels. So I think this is like a disastrous way of being, which is why I talk in that book about the classroom trying to be an exception to this exterior landscape.
I was creating a hierarchy because I thought that was what teaching was. A sage on the stage, as John Vigna put it earlier. When he first started teaching, he had a different approach.
I grew up in a time, many of us did, when our model teachers taught differently than perhaps we might be teaching today. And and I don't mean that in a negative way. It was just a sign of the time. Some were very strict. Some were very, didn't seem to have a lot of compassion or empathy for the students. And, I always remembered in my university experience as an undergraduate student, when I struggled, as most of us do at some point during our undergrads, is that the moments I remember most were it's not the content I learned, but were the moments of kindness from various instructors that just offered some ventilation for my life at that time, whether I was struggling to get an assignment in on time, whether I was struggling to understand concepts within the course or something, is that they would seem to have taken the time and shown interest in a way that could sort of offer me a way to kind of continue to grow instead of to feel like I was always behind or shamed into not knowing and keeping up.
John decided to be that empathetic teacher, the kind one. But still, it was hard to let go of some of the things we believe a teacher has to be.
I couldn't separate out as well in the early days, also being kind of a little more rigid around like guidelines for assignments, submission times and all of these things. And so that was kind of in contrast with trying to be more empathetic as an instructor. And I noticed a real tension in myself in doing this because I didn't like playing good cop, bad cop within myself. I didn't see any value in it after a while. And it just created kind of too much conflict within myself. But also I saw that it wasn't helping students sort of reach their better selves, their writer selves, basically. And, I only have one goal when I'm teaching a class, and that's for the students to have a sensational learning experience so that they may consider still writing beyond this course instead of writing is not for me, which has happened to so many people in other experiences with it. And I didn't want them coming through my classroom with that experience. I wanted them to sort of discover a love for writing, even if they didn't think they could see it coming. And so as like the years went on, I continued to work with the course material, and I started to feel more comfortable in my own skin as a teacher. I started to let go of the rigidness. And when I started to let go of the rigidness with the way that I would sort of approach and handle students, it just opened up a whole new experience in teaching in which I could be a little more authentically myself instead of just my teacher self, because we all wear different sort of selves when we're in front of the classroom. And by being a little more authentic myself, I realized I had just accept them for where they're at. Why am I being rigid about any of these things? And so, this was quite a while ago. And I found that from that point on, I loved teaching even more because I was no longer in conflict with myself or other students around, the things that would disappoint me, whether they didn't do an assignment and hand it in, or whether they did, it was apparent to me that they didn't put a lot of effort into it or anything like that. I could work with that and start to see why is it that they're like that? Oh, it's because they have a lot of other courses in their lives or stresses and life situations and stuff. So this real kind of focused empathy really changed everything.
I had a hard time letting go of that rigidness too. Not only was I reproducing the way I was taught, I believed that in being strict with deadlines and attendance, I was preparing the students for work in the actual field. Again, best intentions, but not effective at all. In the end, I decided on letting go of my authority completely. It did feel like the relief John just described, but it brought another crisis. With my old model discarded, I had to figure out what the new model would be, how it would actually work.
I think that it also comes a lot from you as a teacher being an open wound. When I go there, I don't go protecting myself. And that sharpness that comes from being personally nude, it pierces the atmosphere of the whole room and the students. I think that, when you show your own misery, people become more misericordioso. I don't know how to say in English, compassive. I mean, if you show your wound and you just show it naturally and you show how to feel comfortable with that, I think that's a implicit, energetic, implicit invitation to just be like that. You know, so it starts from the teacher being an open wound to the students, and like to generate a horizontal environment. I always start also my classes saying that I don't consider myself as a teacher, but in Spanish would be compañera, companion, sort of, because etymologically speaking, companion, compañera in Spanish means the one that shares the bread and the pathos and the suffer. And I always say that in the sense that our workshop is like our feast as well, like a space to share the bread that is the word, every word, and the pathos, you know, the difficulty of taking every word, like to taking out every word from silence, that traumatic experience of taking language out of silence. And at the same time, I'm a companion, a compañera, not only of bread, but also of wine, in the sense that in wine we celebrate joy, the joy of having taken language out of silence, and the joy of poetry, of being able to, you know, to share that other dimension of language that is singing, you know. And it's related more to poetry than to narrative in that sense.
So instead of sages on the stages, we have to become compañeros and compañeras. I don't know enough about the Spanish language to make up a non-binary version of that word, but please consider it included. Because that's it, right? Inclusion, a shared space, a shared experience, where we're all along for the ride, next to each other, not above each other. Though there still is something the teacher should add to this. And I don't mean this in a all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others kind of way. I'll let Jesse Ball explain.
I think that this would be one of the ways in which the teacher is fundamentally a slightly different member of the classroom than, because usually I like to think of it as everyone is the same in the classroom. But I mean that really in terms of confidence that people have in the truth of what you say. That should be the same for everyone, that you put something forth and it can be questioned the same, whoever says it, whether it's the teacher or any member of the class. So in that way, status-wise, everyone is the same. But in fact, the responsibility and obligation of the teacher is greater, because the teacher should be always looking out for the emotional dynamics between the different students. So if one person is hurt by another student, by something that was said, it's not like you have to, you know, throw down the hammer or stop everything or whatnot, but just that you perceive that this person is hurt, and then like you can say something which somehow buttresses their confidence, especially in a quite subtle way, where you're not like chiding the person who hurt them or something, because potentially people are often hurt in ways that are unreasonable or unfair, since it's based on a prior precedent that occurred outside of that classroom, you know. But if you are really paying attention to everyone, and then you notice that someone's hurt, then you can make some kind of it's often with tinges of comedy. Like the comedy is the great alleviator, you know. So there's always ways of like joining in someone else's humiliation to you know, make their burden a little less. And what happens over the course of the semester is that as you become more and more like demonstrating gentleness and kindness and like a joint sensibility, other students will take that up. So I rarely have had a class where I'm the only one who is watching out for all the others. And so then in fact, a class by the end might have, you know, 8 teacher types and only 4 sort of student types, because everyone is sort of teaching each other and looking out for one another and being kind.
To refer to our last episode, we have to create a classroom where anyone can become anything. It is a teacher's responsibility to create this classroom, be a part of it, and making sure everyone is being included. Being the first defender or guard of that sacred space, in the hopes others will follow suit. So it turns out it's not at all about 3-act structure, script formatting guidelines, or the importance of Deleuze for the modern artist. It's about empathy, mostly.
Because those other things don't matter, but the acts of kindness, the acts of care to show students that they're supported, mean everything more than subject matter, in fact. And this was, when I realized this, like I said earlier on, it changed everything, because I no longer had to feel like I needed to be the so-called expert in the room and sort of keep up with that. Is if I was like a decent human being in the room, then all of my knowledge that I could bring to the classroom through my discipline, the writing, and through as a teacher, now provided a space for students to really flourish within themselves. And that's really what I think true learning is, to create a stage of comfort and trust for the students so that they can really aspire to be a better version of themselves that they can't yet see because they haven't had that opportunity or been provided the support with. So that for me has been the most profound evolution in my teaching.
The idea of love, I think it's fundamental in teaching. Like you truly have to love your students. You truly have to love them in the way to understand what they're trying to do through their writing, like that piece of gold that's hidden into the mine. You have to be able to show it to them.
It's just you go in and you attempt to be a person who, to the best of your knowledge, is worth being around. Someone who can be like kind and careful with others, and then you try to create an environment with them where altogether you can learn. If there is a requirement that the teacher has to have to be remarkable, that shouldn't be to to have some kind of like genius pronouncements of one kind or another. Their genius should be in reaching the students. So being able to take the temperature of how the students are feeling and understanding how to lead them along to a place where the learning can take place.
But what will that learning be? In one way, you can never tell. In another, we'll talk about it in the next and final episode of this series, which will be released next week. Thanks again to all the interviewees for helping me think all of this through, for providing their own experiences, their advice, and their time. They were, in order of appearance, Jessie Ball, Lorena Briedis, and John Vigna. Teaching Art is a podcast by me, Dennis Gaens, for Studium Generale Artes. Thank you for listening.
So that was like a real learning out of that experience of having only 2 students left after the first trimester.
What did you change after that?
I think I related to my Caribbeanness more.
You have to explain.
Well, there is something fabulous about the Caribbean, that it's like the gift of lightness. Like this sense of that everything seems light. And I think that was my new approach, like resorting to that gift of lightness, of that we're talking about all this, but we're talking about the wound and the sacred and everything, like with the natural, like as natural as we were talking about the weather, you know, like, and maybe surfing the wave in the sense that, you know, like in the sense that students won't feel intimidated or afraid by the solemnity of these conversations.